Hi, everybody. All right. Oh, my gosh. Good evening, everyone. Goodness, I hope I'm not hurting this. Can you still see the seal and do what you need to do? Okay. Where is my good friend John Katko? It is really well worth everyone's time to be here. I could not be prouder to be celebrating 10 years retired by Carl Levin, the success of the Levin Center. Thank you to Paul. Thank you to Dean Bierschbach, Provost Klebo, and everyone else. I know there's a lot of people in the room who really care about Carl Levin, served with Carl Levin, and got a chance to learn from Carl Levin, which I got to do a little bit. I'm particularly happy to be here with my friend John Katko. We served together in the House, and I think I invited him here. I put his name on the list for the Levin Center to reach out to him because when we served together, I really felt like this was what our government was supposed to look like. A Republican and a Democrat working on the Homeland Security Committee. He's former Department of Justice, I'm former CIA, putting the mission of the country ahead of partisanship. And then John and I also served in something called the Problem Solvers Caucus together. That's the only bipartisan caucus left in the US House. Equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans. You literally have to find someone on the other side of the aisle and walk in 2 by 2 like Noah's Ark in order to get in. You sign a civility pledge. Can you imagine how badly we need that in our country right now? So John and I also served in that bipartisan group together. And when we wanted to have a conversation about bipartisanship, he was the first person I thought of, and I'm really thankful that he made the trip. So thank you. Okay, so I have a lot to say in front of the Levin Center about Carl Levin. I think for many of us, Carl is the example, certainly in the state of Michigan, but way beyond Michigan, for what it means to serve with integrity. I remember when I was running for the first time, and I ran in a Republican-leaning district, and so people would come up to me and they'd say, I didn't agree with Carl on X, and I didn't agree with Carl on Y, and I didn't agree with Carl on Z, but he had integrity, so I voted for him. And I think that's just about the highest standard you can get to in a state like Michigan. Our paths crossed many times. Most formally for me was my first trip ever to Washington, D.C. at 11 years old. And because we knew someone who knew someone, we got in with our senator. I remember his office seemed like this massive, amazing place to me, very historic. One of the most fun things in the world is I got to hang out in that same office. It's now held by Senator Michael Bennet. And when I went to go visit him in our first sort of in-call, he was pointing out to me all the things that had been handed down from Carl. I'm going to steal some of those because Michael Bennet is leaving the Senate. I'm going to steal some of them back. So the first time I ever got a taste of Washington was through going to Carl Levin's office. Then many years later, I was the special assistant for the first director of national intelligence, John Negroponte. And I was like a baby, almost like bag carrier, making sure that he got to where he needed to go when he was briefing Congress. And after he briefed Carl in the Armed Services Committee, John Negroponte introduced me and said, she's from Michigan. And he said, what's your name? And I said, Alyssa Slotkin. He said, Slotkin. Who is Hugo Slotkin to you? And I said, that's my grandfather. And he said, my father represented your grandfather in actually a discrimination case when a house was sold out from under my grandfather in Grosse Pointe. Because he was Jewish and Carl's father represented him. So it was just one of those perfect examples of Carl Levin, whip smart, just went back into the files as I was standing there and figured out that he remembered the name. And then many, many years later after that, Carl Levin's final hearing as the chairman of the Armed Services Committee was my confirmation hearing to be an Assistant Secretary of Defense. And one of the great joys and pains of my life was that confirmation hearing, because while Carl got to chair it, John McCain was real mad that day, and I was on the receiving end of the full McCain treatment that afternoon. But it's one of the things that I'm most proud of, is that I got to be there for his final hearing as a chairman. I think the thing that I really remember about Carl Levin, besides his great integrity, was that he cared deeply in his bones for the state of Michigan. And you could have a conversation with him years later when he retired that could range between small town politics, to big national security issues. He could hang high and hang low. He could do both of those things. I think that it's easy for me to say that the model I have as a senator is most definitely Carl Levin, especially someone like me who comes from the national security world. I was always eager for his advice. When I started to run myself for the first time in 2018, I sought him out. He was sitting in that Honigman office, some of you may remember, and it was like stacked papers. I mean, you could barely see this man. He had stacked papers around him. He had his glasses down like the kindly old shoemaker, down on his nose, and he would sit there and give me an incredible amount of time for someone who had never run, for someone who was running in a tough district and wasn't favored to win. Carl was the first person, I think, to really take me seriously from the elected world. And then he became one of the first people to endorse me. And one of the pictures I have in my office is a picture of him writing down notes on one of those Senate cards, trying to figure out what he was going to say in my endorsement event. Now, in classic Carl Levin fashion, when we called him and said, would you ever consider endorsing her? Would you do an event? That would be such a big deal for me. He's like, I would be happy to, but can someone get me a ride? And so my staffer in like a Honda Civic picked up Carl Levin, and he did not care, right? There was no pretension about him, no need for the armored SUV to pick him up. He was as humble on the first day he started as the final day that he left the Senate, which is, again, an important lesson that elected leaders could learn from today. So he endorsed me in that race, and what he said in that speech, I think, is extremely relevant to the times we're living in. He said, quote, "I don't think it has ever been more important in our history that Congress provide a check on the executive branch because of the person we have in the White House right now." That's what he said then. I think his words ring true today. That was obviously in President Trump's first administration. But I think I constantly think to myself now, with everything going on in 2025, I think to myself, what would Carl Levin do? WWCLD. What would Carl Levin do when faced with really difficult questions, essential questions of our democracy? He was never one to simply complain, right? He was not going to do what we call at the Pentagon admiring the problem, talking about it and examining it, but then not doing anything about it. He was someone who acted. And his primary way of acting was through his passion, which was investigations, right? He served on important committees that helped expose the loopholes that the executive branch and other powerful people were exploiting to get ahead. He would want right now Congress to reassert its Article I powers, just the basic things that are in the Constitution, that the Congress has the power of the purse, and the executive must work with, not against the Congress if they want money and to make financial decisions. We're seeing these kinds of abuses that would have him turn in his grave in real time. Attacking independent organizations like the Fed and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, deploying the military in American streets, refusing to spend congressionally appropriated funds, and usurping the power of the purse, personally profiting off the presidency would really irk him. And the president has become, we believe, a billionaire in the meme coin that he has issued. This would really turn Carl over. He hated when people got rich off the backs of the taxpayer. He would be leading the charge if he was here to fix these issues. He'd be investigating all of these things, and he'd be building support for the legislation to close those loopholes. He spent nearly a decade investigating how corporations and individuals were using tax loopholes to avoid paying near $100 billion in taxes. And one of his most famous investigations was on Enron, right? Seems like 100 years ago, but on Enron, where Enron had massive debts and inflated earnings. He introduced a legislation to close what's now called the Enron loophole, which allowed many of these abuses. And he fought hard to pass it. He built coalitions to pass it, including across the aisle, and eventually succeeded overcoming a presidential veto, which is not an easy thing to do. But I think that Carl would also recognize in a very twisted way that what Trump and those around him are doing provides us actually a roadmap of where we need to make government oversight stronger. I think one of the things that Trump has laid bare is that a lot of things that we thought were maybe enshrined in law were actually just tradition and habit and practice of good and decent people on both sides of the aisle. That's what we need to be doing and taking from the "what would Carl do" mantra from both parties. We need to call out things that we disagree with, even if we're worried that the president may go after us because of those words. We need to then try and fix those loopholes. That's our job in Congress and as elected representatives of the people. We need to reassert that Article 1 authority and that voice of the people. That brings me to another important point, which is holding the president and the executive branch accountable should not be a partisan exercise, right? What is hardest for me as a very brand new baby freshman senator is watching some of my peers on the other side of the aisle, many of them who I grew up with. Right? I mean, some of my peers have been in for 30 years. So when I was a baby CIA analyst, they would come on Senate delegations to Baghdad, and I'd be like shoved out there to brief them. These are the people that I'm now serving with, and I had great respect for many of them on both sides of the aisle. But to watch them give away their power, to watch them take what I know 30 years ago they would never have considered, kind of giving the red carpet to the president to dictate what this separate branch of government does, that to me oversight should not be a partisan exercise. It should be something we all are engaged in. And I think, it's not just a Democrat or Republican thing, it's an American thing to provide oversight. Just by being born in this country, distrust of power is kind of in our DNA, right? We were occupied by the British, we were a colony, and we did not like that. And so we rose up and we overthrew that regime. It's part of who we are as Americans that we don't always just take hook, line, and sinker what our elected officials in power are telling us. And Carl knew that for America to endure, government oversight had to be nonpartisan. Questioning power is not some sort of deficit. It is actually patriotism. It actually makes our policies stronger and more durable. It's interesting, one of his first PSI investigations was on foreign campaign donations back in 1996. This probe was sparked by an allegation that the Clinton campaign had received money from Chinese donors. That was the allegation. It was a pretty broad-ranging investigation of campaign finance. It was led by Carl Levin and a Democrat John Glenn, who into the re-election of a Democrat in the White House. Right, 2 Democrats going at a Democratic leader. It was important that Carl didn't just shy away from abuses on the Democratic side, and he felt like his investigation was even more important for that reason. In 2009, as chairman of the Armed Services Committee, he held hearings on President Obama's surge in Afghanistan, quite critically, right? Sharply questioning the Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates at the time, and Secretary Hillary Clinton, about the wisdom of sending an additional 35,000 troops to Afghanistan. So it's just by looking at his life, you can see this ideal of the Senate and of senators who did not fear their own party, their own political ramifications. And that's what we need today. Carl, I think in closing, he almost to a fault wanted to do the right thing. Many of us who are in the national security world realized that actually during Carl Levin's time as chairman of the Armed Services Committee, we actually dropped the number of defense jobs in Michigan slightly. There is no other elected leader who wouldn't have used their position to just create a jobs program and bring all these things to Michigan. He understood that he had a higher purpose in making sure the military was prepared for future fights and didn't use his position in order to make himself look good or in order to just sort of feed the beast back home. So I'm not naive. There are lots of barriers. We can't just be like Carl and it's all going to work out. But I just think today, in honor of the 10th anniversary of the center, it was good to remind ourselves of what would Carl be doing right now. And to not let that flame of passion and oversight die with him, but maintain it. Lastly, I'll just say I appreciate the opportunity to be here. As I said, as your freshman senator, we couldn't have a better example for me to look up to. And for what it's worth, in front of a bunch of people who worked for him, who loved him, who knew him, who supported him, and the center that is carrying on his legacy, I will do everything in my power to carry on that legacy myself every single day in the moment we find ourselves in. So thank you for having me.